On the night before my ceremony, I opened the wrong door and found my mate, the beta, locked in a kiss with my own sister. The moon-blessed gown, the vows, the future I dreamed of, shattered in an instant. But when I thought humiliation would end me, the powerful Alpha King rose before the pack and declared, if she was meant for a beta, she deserves nothing less than a king, and I will be that, for her. Chapter 1. The Burden of Command. Alpha King Darien stood alone in his war room, studying maps of border skirmishes as dawn broke over his kingdom. At 32, he had ruled for 8 years. Every decision weighted with the lives of thousands. His advisors wouldn't arrive for hours. He preferred these solitary moments when he could think without the constant pressure of courtly expectations. The weight of the crown felt heavier each morning, a burden inherited too young when his father died in battle, leaving him to rule a realm he'd barely begun to understand. The castle walls echoed with emptiness that matched the hollow ache in his chest. No wife, no children, no personal connections beyond duty and obligation. His mother had died birthing him, making him an heir shaped by tutors and generals rather than love and warmth. He'd learned early that emotional attachments made kings weak, that personal desires were luxuries he couldn't afford. Every potential marriage alliance had been calculated for political advantage, every relationship measured against the kingdom's needs rather than his heart's desires. The irony wasn't lost on him. He commanded the loyalty of thousands, yet felt utterly alone. His days were filled with meetings, audiences, decisions that affected lives he would never know personally. He moved through ceremonies and state functions like an actor playing a role, saying the right words, making the appropriate gestures, maintaining the necessary distance that preserved royal dignity. But in quiet moments like this, when the performance ended, the silence was deafening. As he traced battle lines on parchment with fingers that had never known a lover's touch, a servant brought news of Sir Kieran's upcoming wedding to Lady Lyra. Alpha King Darien had observed the young woman at court, intelligent, kind, graceful under pressure. Something about her quiet strength reminded him of what he'd lost when he'd closed his heart to anything beyond duty. She spoke to servants with genuine respect, offered thoughtful insights during the few council meetings she'd attended, carried herself with natural dignity that needed no crown to command respect. He dismissed the thought quickly, telling himself that a king's personal feelings were irrelevant, especially regarding another man's bride. Yet the feeling lingered like an ache he couldn't name, a whisper of possibility he dared not acknowledge. Chapter 2. Shadows of Doubt. 3 days before the wedding, Alpha King Darien walked his battlements under starlight, a ritual that helped him process the day's challenges and find some measure of peace in the darkness. The kingdom spread below him like a carpet of scattered lights, each one representing lives that depended on his wisdom, his strength, his ability to make the right choices. The responsibility should have felt overwhelming, yet these midnight walks provided his only true solace, moments when he could shed the performance of kingship and simply exist as a man, grappling with impossible burdens. Below in the courtyard, movement caught his attention. Sir Kieran speaking urgently with someone in the shadows. His knight's posture was furtive, guilty, the body language of deception that King Darien had learned to read during years of court intrigue and battlefield strategy. He couldn't hear words from this distance, but the conversation reeked of conspiracy. Kieran kept glancing toward the castle walls. His companion remained hidden, and their gestures carried the urgency of people discussing dangerous secrets. When the figure stepped into moonlight, revealing Lady Seraphina, Alpha King Darien's jaw tightened with recognition and growing concern. He'd watched her at court. Beautiful but calculating, ambitious in ways that reminded him of courtiers who'd tried to manipulate his youth and inexperience. Her smiles never reached her eyes. Her compliments always served some purpose. Her presence at social gatherings felt performed rather than genuine. Seeing her with Kieran so close to his wedding sparked something protective in King Darien's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name but couldn't dismiss. The interaction triggered memories of his own isolation, of watching others form connections while he remained apart by necessity and design. Perhaps that's why Lady Lyra's situation affected him so deeply. She represented something pure in a court full of schemes and hidden agendas. Her genuine kindness, her natural grace, her obvious intelligence unmarred by calculation, all stood in stark contrast to the political maneuvering he navigated daily. Seeing that purity potentially threatened awakened instincts he'd buried beneath royal duty, protective urges he'd never allowed himself to feel for anyone outside his immediate family obligations. He descended from the battlements with a growing sense that trouble was brewing, though he didn't yet understand how deeply it would change everything he thought he knew about himself and his capacity for feelings beyond duty. Chapter 3. The Garden Revelation. Unable to sleep, haunted by images of furtive conversations and growing certainties about brewing trouble, Alpha King Darien returned to his watch the following night. This time, when he saw Kieran slip into the gardens like a shadow, instinct compelled him to follow at a distance. Years of military training had taught him to move silently, to observe without being observed, skills that served him well as he tracked his knight through moonlit paths toward the ancient oak that had witnessed countless royal ceremonies and private moments throughout the castle's long history. What he witnessed beneath that sacred tree shattered his assumptions about honor among his knights and the nature of the man he'd trusted with his kingdom's defense. Kieran and Seraphina embraced with desperate passion, their bodies intertwined with the familiarity of long practice, their whispered words carrying on the night wind like poison. Plans to humiliate Lyra publicly, to steal her dowry and position through calculated cruelty, to use the wedding ceremony itself as a stage for their betrayal. The casual malice in their voices, the pleasure they took in planning another woman's destruction, revealed depths of corruption that made his stomach turn. Rage filled King Darien's chest, not the cold fury of a wronged king discovering treachery among his ranks, but something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just betrayal of marriage vows or violation of knightly honor. It was the deliberate destruction of an innocent woman who deserved protection rather than persecution. For the first time in years, his heart overruled his head. Emotion swept aside calculation. Personal feeling trumped political consideration. He thought of Lyra's quiet dignity during court functions, her genuine kindness to servants and nobles alike, her intelligence evident in the few conversations they'd shared, her natural grace that needed no artifice to command respect. As he retreated through shadows to plan his response, every fiber of his being focused on preventing the injustice he'd witnessed being planned. King Darien realized something fundamental had shifted within him. The emotional wall he'd built around his heart, constructed brick by brick through years of isolation and duty, had developed cracks that now threatened to bring down the entire structure. Seeing planned injustice directed at someone who'd unknowingly touched his soul had awakened feelings he'd suppressed for nearly a decade. Tomorrow's wedding would not proceed as planned, and for the first time since his coronation, King Darien would act from the heart rather than cold calculation. The king was about to discover what it meant to feel again, and the revelation would transform everything he thought he knew about power, duty, and the terrible, wonderful vulnerability of caring for someone beyond himself. Chapter 4. The Wedding Disruption Alpha King. Darien arrived at the cathedral armed with righteous fury and a plan that defied every rule of royal protocol established over centuries of tradition. His destrier's hooves rang against the marble floor like thunder as he rode directly into the sacred space, an unprecedented breach that sent shockwaves through every witness present. The assembled nobility gasped in collective horror at this violation of custom, but King Darien felt no uncertainty, no hesitation. Watching Lyra walk down that aisle toward public humiliation and private betrayal had ignited something primal in his chest, something that demanded action regardless of consequences. Standing before the assembly in his battle armor, still dusty from the hard ride to reach the cathedral in time, King Darien felt the weight of absolute authority flow through him like molten steel. But this time, that power served a personal purpose rather than mere political duty. Every word he spoke was calculated to protect Lyra and destroy the conspiracy against her. Yet beneath his royal composure, his heart hammered with something he hadn't felt in years: the desperate need to save someone who mattered to him personally, not politically. The distinction was crucial and terrifying. When he declared Lyra worthy to be his queen, the words escaped before his rational mind could stop them, flowing from some deeper source than political calculation or strategic planning. He'd crossed a line that changed everything, from detached ruler observing others' dramas to a man publicly declaring his heart's choice. The declaration bound him irrevocably to a path he'd never planned, transforming him from calculating monarch to someone willing to risk everything for love. Around him, the cathedral erupted in shocked whispers and gasps of disbelief, but all he could see was Lyra's face, pale with surprise but beautiful with dawning hope. In that moment of absolute commitment, King Darien began to die, replaced by simply King Darien, a man discovering what it meant to love someone enough to abandon safety and certainty. The weight of his choice settled onto his shoulders like new armor, heavier than duty alone, but infinitely more meaningful. He'd spent 8 years making decisions based on what his kingdom needed. Now, for the first time, he was making a choice based on what his heart demanded. The transformation was terrifying and exhilarating, a leap into unknown territory where personal happiness and royal responsibility would have to find some way to coexist. As he extended his hand toward Lyra, he knew he was offering not just his crown, but his soul, trusting that she would prove worthy of both. Chapter 5. The Choice Made. In the silence following his declaration, King Darien experienced a moment of pure terror that cut through his battle-tested courage like a blade through silk. He'd just upended centuries of royal protocol, announced a marriage alliance without council approval, revealed his heart to enemies who would use that vulnerability against him, and committed himself to a path with no possibility of retreat. His advisors would be furious when they learned of this breach of tradition. Neighboring kingdoms would question his judgment and stability, and his own nobles might interpret this emotional display as a dangerous weakness in their sovereign. Every lesson of kingship screamed that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, that personal feelings had no place in royal decision-making, that he'd just demonstrated exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that led to dynastic collapse and political chaos. The boy in him, shaped by tutors who'd emphasized control and calculation above all else, wanted to retreat, to find some way to undo the words that hung in the air like an irrevocable verdict. Yet, as he watched Lyra process his offer, her face cycling through shock, understanding, and something that might have been relief, he knew retreat was impossible. But when Lyra placed her trembling hand in his, when their eyes met with mutual recognition of something deeper than politics or convenience, when he felt the electric connection of two souls recognizing their perfect match, King Darien knew he'd finally made the right choice for the right reasons. Her courage in accepting his offer despite the circumstances, her dignity in the face of public humiliation, her trust in his protection despite barely knowing him personally. These qualities spoke to his soul in ways no political alliance ever could. She wasn't just beautiful or well-born, she was genuinely good in a world that had taught him to distrust goodness. As he banished Kieran and Seraphina with words that carried the finality of royal judgment, King Darien felt the addictive rush of acting from conviction rather than mere calculation. For 8 years, he'd suppressed every personal desire for the kingdom's good, made every choice based on political advantage rather than personal preference, and maintained the emotional distance that preserved royal dignity. Now, for the first time, his personal happiness aligned with justice and moral righteousness. Leading Lyra from the cathedral with her hand secure in his, he realized he'd committed himself to learning how to be human again, how to love without losing his strength, how to rule with both mind and heart. The real journey toward becoming the man and king he was meant to be was just beginning, and despite the uncertainties ahead, he'd never felt more alive or more certain of his path forward. Chapter 6. Facing the Council. The royal council erupted in barely controlled chaos the moment King Darien entered the chamber, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, anger, and political calculation. Lord Chancellor Malcolm's complexion had turned an alarming shade of red, while the other advisors whispered frantically among themselves about damage control, political ramifications, and the unprecedented nature of their king's emotional decision. They'd built their careers on King Darien's predictable rationality, his careful consideration of every political angle, his willingness to subordinate personal desires to royal duty. His sudden emotional decision had shattered their carefully constructed expectations and left them scrambling to understand this new version of their sovereign. For the first time in his reign, King Darien found himself defending a personal choice rather than explaining a political strategy, and the experience proved both challenging and liberating. The questions came like arrows shot from a dozen bows. What about the diplomatic alliance with Seraphina's family that his marriage was supposed to cement? How would neighboring kingdoms interpret this impulsive action as evidence of instability? What precedent did this set for royal decision-making? What message did this send about the reliability of treaties and agreements made with their kingdom? Each criticism struck at his deepest fears about leadership, about the delicate balance between personal desires and royal duties that every king had to navigate. Yet, as he defended his choice with growing confidence, articulating his reasoning with the same precision he'd once applied to military strategy, King Darien discovered something unexpected and encouraging. His reasons were sound, even by the coldest political standards. Lyra's intelligence, demonstrated in her few appearances at court functions, made her an excellent queen candidate. Her integrity and natural grace would enhance rather than diminish the royal house's reputation. Her family's standing, while not as elevated as Seraphina's, carried no political liabilities or embarrassing associations. Most importantly, his public rescue of an innocent woman from calculated betrayal enhanced rather than damaged his reputation for justice and moral leadership. The revelation that struck him most powerfully was the understanding that sometimes, perhaps more often than he'd realized, the heart's choice and the mind's calculation could align in perfect harmony. His love for Lyra wasn't just personally fulfilling, it was politically sound. His emotional response to injustice wasn't just morally satisfying, it was strategically beneficial. His willingness to act from feeling rather than cold analysis hadn't weakened his position. It had revealed new sources of strength he'd never known he possessed. He dismissed the council with newfound confidence, ready to prove that love could strengthen rather than weaken a king, that emotional intelligence could enhance rather than compromise political effectiveness. The man who'd spent 8 years fearing that personal feelings would make him weak was about to discover that the right feelings could make him stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. Chapter 7. Learning to court King Darien found himself in utterly unfamiliar territory, courting a woman who knew nothing of his private self beyond the dramatic rescue that had brought them together. Years of royal isolation had left him supremely skilled at commanding armies, negotiating treaties, and managing the complex political relationships that kept his kingdom stable, but utterly hopeless at the subtle art of winning a heart through genuine connection rather than royal authority. He'd never learned the gentle arts of intimate conversation, the patient building of personal trust, the emotional vulnerability required for true intimacy between equals. Every instinct developed through years of self-protection screamed at him to maintain emotional distance, to preserve the carefully constructed barriers that had kept him safe from potential rejection or betrayal. His first attempts at courtship were disasters of royal formality that satisfied no one, least of all himself. He sent gifts chosen by servants who knew protocol but not personal preference, arranged activities that showcased his power and position rather than revealing his character or interests, spoke in the measured tones of kingship rather than the authentic voice of a man discovering what it meant to care for someone beyond duty. Lyra received his formal attention with gracious politeness that made his heart sink, acknowledging each gesture with the respect due to her king, but showing none of the warmth or genuine interest he desperately wanted to see in her eyes. She was grateful for his rescue, certainly, and impressed by his willingness to defend her honor, but he could see the distance that remained between them, the gap between the royal figure who'd saved her from humiliation and the private man she had no reason to love. Her responses were correct, appropriate, and utterly lacking in the emotional connection he craved but had no idea how to create. The breakthrough came when she found him in the stables at dawn, not in the throne room or council chamber where she'd expected their next formal meeting. Here, among the horses he'd loved since childhood, away from servants and ceremony and the weight of royal expectations, King Darien finally showed her glimpses of the man beneath the crown. When she laughed at his stories of his destrier's stubborn personality, when she helped him tend a wounded mare with gentle competence, when they shared comfortable silence watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, he began to understand that love required authenticity rather than majesty. The distance between them began to close, not when he displayed his power, but when he revealed his humanity. Not when he acted like a king, but when he allowed himself to simply be a man discovering what it meant to hope for someone's affection, rather than merely commanding their respect. Chapter 8. The Test of Trust. 3 weeks into their courtship, when King Darien was just beginning to believe that genuine connection might be possible between them, crisis struck in the form of urgent reports from the northern borders. Raiders had been striking supply convoys with increasing boldness, suggesting either new leadership among the barbarian tribes or foreign manipulation designed to destabilize his kingdom. Every instinct developed through 8 years of solitary rule demanded he handle the crisis alone, trusting no one with sensitive military information that could be used against him if it fell into the wrong hands. But Lyra's intelligent questions about the situation, her obvious concern for the people being affected, her natural grasp of the political implications, sparked an idea that both terrified and intrigued him. What if he shared this burden instead of bearing it in isolation? What if partnership meant more than romantic gestures and formal courtship rituals? What if the woman he was learning to love could also become a genuine advisor whose insights might actually improve his decision-making rather than merely providing emotional comfort? Against centuries of royal tradition that kept women away from military planning, against the horrified protests of advisors who viewed female involvement in warfare as unprecedented and potentially disastrous, King Darien invited Lyra into his war council. The shocked faces around the table reflected his own uncertainty about this radical departure from established protocol, but her contributions proved immediately valuable. She saw patterns in the raid locations that his generals had missed, suggested diplomatic solutions to complement military responses, and asked questions about local politics that revealed potential flaws in their strategic assumptions. The successful resolution of the border crisis proved that vulnerability could indeed become strength when shared with the right person. Lyra's contributions had demonstrably improved their response, identifying a local noble's treachery that had enabled the raids and suggesting a solution that addressed root causes rather than merely symptoms. More importantly, for his personal transformation, her presence had eased the crushing weight of solitary decision-making that had worn at his soul for years. For the first time since his coronation, he'd experienced the luxury of shared responsibility, of having someone genuinely invested in his kingdom's welfare rather than merely concerned with personal advancement. The fear of loving someone who couldn't truly understand or share his burden began to fade, replaced by the intoxicating possibility that he'd found not just a lover but a true partner in every sense of the word. Chapter 9. The Assassin's Blade. The attack came during what should have been a routine visit to the market square, where King Darien had been showing Lyra the kingdom she might one day help rule, introducing her to merchants and craftsmen whose lives their decisions would affect. He'd grown comfortable in these informal settings, enjoying the way she interacted with common people, appreciating her genuine interest in their concerns, and her natural ability to make everyone feel heard and valued. The normalcy of the moment, sunlight, laughter, the simple pleasure of walking among his people without ceremony made the sudden violence all the more shocking. A hired blade emerged from the crowd like death incarnate, clearly targeting the king with professional efficiency that spoke of careful planning and substantial payment. But Lyra's quick thinking and faster reflexes saved his life in a way that changed everything he thought he understood about their relationship. As she pushed him aside and shouted a warning that allowed his guards to intercept the assassin, as she placed herself between him and danger without hesitation or calculation, King Darien realized his growing love had created a terrible new vulnerability. not in himself, but in her. Lying in the castle infirmary with a minor wound that could have been fatal without her intervention, King Darian grappled with crushing guilt that threatened to undo all the emotional progress he'd made. His choice to love had painted a target on Lyra's back, had made her a weapon his enemies could use against him in ways that went far beyond political pressure or military threat. Every king before him had faced this same dilemma: how to protect those you love when your very position makes them targets. The traditional solution was elegantly simple: don't love anyone. But now that he'd tasted the richness of genuine connection, returning to emotional isolation felt like a form of death. The revelation that transformed his understanding came from Lyra herself, sitting beside his sickbed with quiet conviction that humbled him completely. She spoke of accepting danger as the price of meaningful love, of preferring a life filled with purpose and risk to safe existence without emotional connection, of understanding that some things were worth potential sacrifice. Her courage in facing the realities of loving a king, her refusal to be sheltered from the consequences of their relationship, her determination to be his partner in danger as well as in peace, revealed a strength that made his protective instincts seem almost insulting. This attack had tested not just their safety, but their partnership, and rather than driving them apart, it had proven that they were strong enough together to face whatever challenges their love might create. The right partner, he realized, wouldn't be someone who needed protection from his world, but someone strong enough to face it beside him as an equal. Chapter 10. The Kieran problem reports from the borderlands painted an increasingly troubling picture that demanded King Darian's attention, despite his preference for focusing on his developing relationship with Lyra. Kieran's band of mercenaries had evolved from a handful of desperate outcasts into a legitimate military threat, and intelligence suggested they were no longer merely surviving, but actively building towards some larger purpose. What disturbed Alpha King Darian most wasn't the military challenge. He'd faced worse rebellions and crushed them decisively, but the intensely personal nature of Kieran's obvious obsession with revenge. This wasn't about political power, territorial gain, or even simple banditry for survival. Every raid, every attack, every message intercepted from Kieran's forces revealed a mind consumed with wounded pride and twisted notions of justice. The disgraced knight truly believed he was the wronged party in their conflict, that his love for Seraphina had been pure while King Darian's feelings for Lyra represented mere royal lust and political calculation. The madness in that reasoning chilled Alpha King Darian's blood and made him realize they were dealing with an enemy who couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated into submission. In council meetings, King Darian found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending emotional decisions with logical arguments while his advisors questioned every choice that prioritized feeling over cold calculation. Why not simply send the army to crush Kieran quickly and decisively? Because making martyrs of disgraced knights could inspire copycat rebellions among other disaffected nobles. Why consider negotiation with a proven traitor? Because understanding his motivations might prevent future betrayals from others who felt wronged by royal justice. But privately, King Darian knew his caution stemmed from darker, more personal concerns: guilt over the man he'd destroyed, and fear that his happiness had been purchased at too high a price in human suffering. The weight of his choices pressed down like armor grown too heavy for his shoulders to bear. Every decision now affected not just his kingdom's welfare, but Lyra's safety, their future together. The precedent he was setting for emotion-driven leadership that future kings would either emulate or reject. The lonely clarity of his past kingship, when choices had been difficult but uncomplicated by personal feelings, seemed almost appealing compared to this complex web of personal and political consequences. Yet when Lyra squeezed his hand during a particularly tense council session, when she offered insights that improved their strategy, when she simply remained present as his anchor in the storm of conflicting demands, he knew he'd never trade this burden for his former isolation. The man he was becoming, complex and conflicted, but infinitely more alive than the king he'd been, was worth every challenge they would face together. Chapter 11. The Midpoint Revelation. The letter arrived with the dawn patrol, carried by a messenger who'd ridden his horse nearly to death to reach the castle before daybreak. Written in Kieran's own hand, and stained with what looked disturbingly like blood, the parchment felt heavy with malice even before King Darian broke the seal. The message was elegantly simple in its madness, a formal challenge to trial by combat, with Lyra as the stated prize and the throne itself as forfeit should the king fall. But the real revelation lay in the letter's tortured reasoning, its twisted logic that painted Kieran as a romantic hero wronged by royal tyranny. Reading those words, King Darian confronted the full scope of his former knight's delusion. Kieran truly believed his love for Seraphina had been pure and noble, while King Darian's feelings for Lyra represented mere lust disguised as rescue. In his mind, the trial by combat would restore proper order, returning the worthy woman to her rightful protector while exposing the king as a fraud who used power to steal what he couldn't earn through genuine affection. The complete disconnect from reality revealed in every sentence made King Darian understand they were dealing with a man who'd constructed an entire alternate version of events to justify his actions. Facing his war council's passionate arguments against accepting the challenge, King Darian confronted a truth that transformed his understanding of kingship itself. Sometimes honor mattered more than safety, character more than survival, moral example more than practical advantage. The legal precedent was absolutely clear. A formal challenge from a knight to his king couldn't be ignored without appearing weak and undermining the entire feudal system. But beyond legal requirements lay deeper questions about the kind of king he wanted to be, the example he would set for future rulers, the legacy he would leave for his children. In accepting Kieran's challenge, despite every advisor's protest, despite the obvious risks to his life and kingdom, King Darian realized he was no longer the calculating monarch who'd once traded pieces on a political chessboard with cold efficiency. That king would have found a way to eliminate Kieran quietly and efficiently, without personal risk or public spectacle that could destabilize the realm. But the man who loved Lyra, who'd learned to value emotional truth alongside political necessity, couldn't hide behind others' courage when honor demanded he face his choices personally. This wasn't about proving his right to Lyra's love. That was between them alone. This was about proving his right to rule through example rather than mere authority, about demonstrating that some principles were worth personal sacrifice. The stakes had moved beyond political survival to something far more precious, the integrity of the man he was becoming, and whether he deserved the love he'd found. Chapter 12. Preparing for Battle. The fortnight of preparation before the combat revealed how completely King Darian's priorities had shifted from the man he'd been just months earlier. Where once he would have trained in solitude, focusing entirely on physical preparation and tactical advantage, now he treasured every moment with Lyra, knowing each shared experience could potentially be their last. She insisted on helping him prepare despite his initial protests, checking his armor with hands that trembled only slightly, discussing strategy with insights that sharpened his own thinking, refusing to be sheltered from the reality of what he faced or the consequences of potential failure. Her strength in confronting the possibility of loss, her determination to be his partner in facing this challenge rather than a helpless victim awaiting rescue, only deepened his love and strengthened his resolve to survive. She understood what he was fighting for better than he did himself, not just their personal happiness, but the principle that love could strengthen rather than weaken a leader, that emotional connection could enhance rather than compromise judgment, that the heart's wisdom could complement rather than contradict the mind's calculations. Training with his swordmaster in the practice yards, King Darian fought with a ferocity that surprised them both, and revealed reserves of strength he'd never accessed in purely political conflicts. The prospect of losing Lyra, of failing to protect what they'd built together, of allowing Kieran's twisted version of events to triumph, unlocked something primal in his fighting spirit. This wasn't about duty or honor in the abstract. It was about defending the first genuine happiness he'd ever known, about proving that transformation and growth were worth any price he might have to pay. The night before the combat, lying beside Lyra in their bed with her head on his chest and her breathing soft against his skin, King Darien finally understood what his father had tried to tell him with his dying words years earlier. A crown without love is just metal, my son. Remember that when your time comes to choose. The king he'd been for 8 years had worn metal, cold and heavy and ultimately meaningless. The man he was becoming wore something far more precious, the weight of another person's trust, the responsibility of shared dreams, the terrifying joy of having something worth dying for. Tomorrow would determine which version of himself would survive, but tonight, holding the woman who'd taught him what it meant to be complete, he knew he'd already won the only victory that truly mattered. Chapter 13. The Dawn of Combat. Standing in the field of combat, as dawn broke across his kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for what might be his final morning, King Darien felt the weight of complete transformation settle into his bones like armor forged from experience rather than steel. The man who faced Kieran bore no resemblance to the isolated king who'd ruled through fear and careful calculation for 8 lonely years. Every choice that had led to this moment, saving Lyra, learning to love, accepting this challenge despite its risks, had stripped away layers of protective distance until only the essential man remained. Kieran's appearance shocked him more than he'd expected, revealing the full cost of months spent consumed by bitterness and obsession. The once handsome knight had become something hollow and desperate, his face gaunt from poor living, his eyes burning with the fever of someone who'd lost touch with reality. Where charm and confidence had once resided, only rage and wounded pride remained. Seeing this broken man, King Darien felt not triumph, but profound sadness for what betrayal and festering resentment could do to a human soul when left untreated. This fight represented more than personal conflict. It was a clash between 2 philosophies about love, power, and what men owed each other. Kieran fought for possession, for the right to take what he believed should have been his regardless of anyone else's feelings. King Darien fought for protection, for the principle that love freely given was the only love worth having. The difference between them wasn't just about Lyra. It was about the fundamental nature of honor itself and whether strength should serve selfishness or something larger than individual desire. As they prepared to charge, King Darien caught sight of Lyra in the stands, her face pale but determined, her eyes reflecting complete faith in his strength and their love's righteousness. In that gaze, he saw not just fear for his safety, but absolute confidence in the man he'd become, in the principles they shared, in the rightness of the path they'd chosen together. That faith transformed his terror into resolve, his uncertainty into clarity. He wasn't fighting as a lonely king defending his pride, but as a man protecting the future he and Lyra would build together, as a leader proving that power guided by love was stronger than power driven by selfish desire. The difference would give him access to reserves of strength that Kieran, fighting only for his own wounded ego, could never understand or match. Chapter 14. The Clash of Ideals. The combat itself became a physical manifestation of competing philosophies about love, honor, and the proper use of power. Kieran fought with the desperate fury of a man who believed the world owed him happiness, who thought he could reclaim by force what had been denied him by choice and circumstance. His attacks were wild and emotional, driven by years of festering resentment that had poisoned his judgment and consumed his former skill. He fought not for love but for possession, not for honor but for vindication of his wounded pride and twisted sense of justice. Every blow Kieran struck carried the weight of his delusions, his absolute conviction that he was the wronged party in their conflict, that his feelings for Seraphina had been pure, while King Darien's love for Lyra represented mere royal lust disguised as rescue. The madness in his eyes, the reckless abandon of his sword work, the complete disconnect from reality that drove his actions all served to highlight the difference between genuine love and selfish obsession. He had become a cautionary tale about what happened when desire curdled into entitlement, when love became just another form of conquest. King Darien found himself fighting with a clarity he'd never experienced before, every movement flowing from a centered understanding of what he protected and why it mattered. This wasn't the cold efficiency of royal training or the mechanical precision of military drill, but something warmer and infinitely more powerful, the strength that comes from fighting for someone else's future, as much as your own. Love hadn't made him weak. It had revealed reserves of power he'd never known he possessed, and had given him access to capabilities that pure technique could never provide. When Kieran's blade finally found flesh, drawing blood from King Darien's sword arm in a moment of successful aggression, the pain brought unexpected clarity rather than weakness. Physical wounds could heal with time and care, but the spiritual damage of losing Lyra, of failing to protect what they'd built together, of allowing Kieran's twisted vision of love to triumph, would never recover. That realization transformed desperation into determination, fear into focus. He would not fail, not because a king could not afford to lose, but because a man in love had everything to fight for and would die before surrendering the happiness he'd finally learned to claim. The tide of battle turned on that moment of absolute commitment, when love proved stronger than madness and truth more powerful than delusion. Chapter 15. Victory and its price. Kieran's defeat came not from superior sword work or tactical advantage, but from the fundamental difference in what they were fighting for and the strength that difference provided. When the disgraced knight finally fell to the bloodied earth, his weapon spinning away from nerveless fingers, his last words revealed the true tragedy of his choices. I loved her first. The pain and confusion in those final syllables reminded King Darien that victory in combat couldn't erase the human cost of these events, couldn't undo the waste of a life that had once shown promise before being twisted by jealousy and pride. Standing over his fallen opponent, breathing hard from exertion and the emotional weight of what had just transpired, King Darien felt the full responsibility of the power he wielded settle onto his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. His choices didn't just affect himself anymore. They shaped the lives of everyone around him, created ripples that touched innocent people like Serafina, destroyed promising people like Kieran, sent messages about justice and mercy that would influence how future conflicts were resolved. The burden of kingship had evolved beyond making good decisions to understanding the human consequences of every action. The weight of that responsibility could have been crushing, might have driven him back toward the emotional isolation that had once seemed like protection from such painful complexities. But when Lyra ran to his arms, not caring about protocol or royal dignity, thinking only of the man she loved, when he felt her tears of relief against his chest and heard the crowd cheering not just for their king's victory, but for their love story's triumph, King Darien knew the cost had been worth paying and would be worth paying again if necessary. He'd learned that some things were worth fighting for regardless of consequences, that strength without love was merely brutality, while love without strength was meaningless sentiment, that the greatest victories were those that protected rather than conquered. The boy king who'd ruled through fear and emotional distance was finally, completely dead, replaced by a man who understood that true power came from having something precious enough to defend with everything he possessed. Around them, the kingdom celebrated not just the defeat of a threat, but the triumph of a love story that had transformed their ruler from a distant figure into someone genuinely worthy of their devotion. The transformation was complete, and the future, however challenging it might prove, belonged to the man he'd become rather than the king he'd been. Chapter 16. The Conspirator's Gambit. 2 months after Kieran's death, when King Darien believed the worst challenges were behind them and he could focus on building the life he and Lyra had envisioned together, the real conspiracy revealed itself with devastating precision. Lord Chancellor Malcolm, whom he'd trusted implicitly for years, presented evidence of a plot that struck at the very foundation of his rule and chilled his blood with its calculated malice. Several noble houses, threatened by what they characterized as his dangerous emotional decision-making, had allied with neighboring kingdoms to formally question his fitness to rule their realm. The accusations struck directly at his deepest fears about balancing love and leadership, exploiting every doubt he'd harbored about his transformation from calculated monarch to emotionally invested man. Every choice he'd made from the heart was systematically reframed as evidence of dangerous weakness, His public marriage proposal showed poor planning and impulsive judgment. His inclusion of Lyra in council meetings violated centuries of tradition and compromised security. His acceptance of Kieran's challenge had risked the kingdom's stability for personal pride, rather than rational consideration of consequences. Worse than the specific charges was the legal precedent they cited. Kings had been deposed before for actions that endangered their realms through emotional excess or poor judgment. The conspiracy had been carefully constructed over months, gathering evidence, building alliances, preparing arguments that painted his growth as a man and leader as fundamental unfitness for the responsibilities of kingship. They presented his greatest strength as his most dangerous weakness, his capacity for love as evidence of instability that threatened everyone who depended on royal protection. Sitting in his private chambers with the formal charges spread before him like a catalogue of his personal growth, King Darian confronted the crushing possibility that learning to love might cost him everything he'd sworn to protect when he'd accepted the crown 8 years earlier. The irony was devastating. In becoming a better man, he might have become a worse king according to those who valued cold calculation over emotional wisdom. The enemies he'd defeated in open combat, who'd fought with swords and honest hatred, had been replaced by shadows who fought with words and laws and twisted logic, who turned his greatest achievements into apparent failures. For the first time since childhood, he felt truly powerless against forces he couldn't fight with strength or courage or moral conviction. Chapter 17. The Isolation Returns. The conspiracy's most devastating weapon wasn't legal documents or political maneuvering, but doubt itself, spreading through the castle like a plague that infected every relationship and poisoned every interaction. Servants who'd once greeted him warmly now averted their eyes when he passed, uncertain whether he'd still be king tomorrow, and afraid to be seen as loyal to someone who might soon be powerless to protect them. Allies who'd supported his reign for years began hedging their bets, offering careful neutrality instead of the loyalty he'd taken for granted. The castle that had become a true home filled with love and laughter grew cold again, echoing with whispers and unspoken questions about his judgment, his future, his worthiness to continue ruling people who deserved better than an emotional monarch who prioritized personal happiness over political wisdom. Every corridor held memories of his transformation from isolated king to complete man, but now those memories felt like accusations, evidence of self-indulgence that had compromised his effectiveness as a leader. King Darian found himself retreating into the emotional fortress he'd abandoned months earlier, trying to protect Lyra from the political poison spreading through court like a contagion that contaminated everything it touched. But isolation felt wrong now, unnatural after months of partnership and shared burdens, like wearing armor that no longer fit properly. He could see the hurt in her eyes when he made excuses to avoid their usual conversations, could feel the distance growing between them as he tried to shield her from his fears about their future together and what his choices might cost them both. The cruelest blow came when he overheard 2 young nobles discussing whether Lyra would be better off if the conspiracy succeeded in removing him from power. They spoke of her as a victim of his selfish choices, trapped in a doomed marriage to a king who'd prioritized personal happiness over political wisdom, who'd dragged an innocent woman into a situation that could destroy her along with him. Their words planted a poison seed of doubt that grew rapidly in the fertile soil of his insecurities. Perhaps his love for her was indeed another form of selfishness, another way he'd failed in his duty to put the kingdom's needs ahead of his own desires. The man who'd learned to love was beginning to wonder if love itself had been his greatest mistake, the error that would cost him everything worth protecting. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. Alone in his father's old study, surrounded by portraits of kings who'd ruled with cold calculation and died unloved but historically successful, King Darian faced the ultimate question that would define the rest of his life. What kind of king was he truly meant to be? The path back to his old ways lay open before him like a road he knew by heart. Annul his marriage to protect Lyra from his political problems, distance himself from emotional entanglements, return to the isolation that had kept him safe and politically effective for 8 years. He could save his crown by sacrificing his heart, becoming once again the calculating monarch his enemies claimed the kingdom needed. The weight of 8 years of lonely rule crashed down on him with devastating clarity, reminding him of exactly what that choice would mean. He remembered the man he'd been before Lyra entered his life, competent but hollow, powerful but spiritually empty, respected but unloved and incapable of genuine connection. That king had made no serious mistakes because he'd taken no meaningful risks, had faced no personal betrayals because he'd formed no personal bonds, had never been vulnerable because he'd never allowed himself to care about anything beyond duty and political necessity. The price of emotional safety had been a kind of spiritual death, a gradual erosion of everything that made him human rather than merely functional. Now he was being asked to die that death again, to return to the emotional wasteland he'd inhabited for most of his adult life, to pretend that the happiness he'd discovered with Lyra had been an illusion rather than the most real thing he'd ever experienced. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to mock him with their stern faces and successful reigns, reminding him that personal fulfillment was a luxury that kings couldn't afford if they wanted to protect their people effectively. In his darkest moment, staring at his father's crown in its ceremonial case, while weighing the cost of keeping it against the price of losing everything that made life worth living, King Darian finally understood the true nature of his choice. This wasn't about choosing between love and duty, personal happiness and political responsibility. It was about choosing between two fundamentally different kinds of strength. The old way offered the strength of stone, unbreakable but lifeless, enduring but incapable of growth or adaptation. The new way offered the strength of steel, harder to forge and more likely to break under extreme pressure but capable of flexibility without losing integrity, able to bend without breaking when circumstances demanded adaptation. The question was whether he had the courage to trust in the harder path, to believe that love could be a source of strength rather than weakness, even when everything seemed to argue against that possibility. Chapter 19. The Heart's Counsel. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, Lyra herself, who confronted him in his study with the quiet fury of someone who'd been shut out too long and refused to accept protective distance as a substitute for genuine partnership. Instead of accepting his attempts to shield her from the political crisis that threatened their future, she demanded to face the challenge as his equal partner, rather than a helpless victim awaiting rescue. Her analysis of the political situation proved sharp and insightful, her proposed solutions practical and innovative, her courage in demanding inclusion exactly what he needed to remember why he'd fallen in love with her intelligence as much as her beauty. "You're making the same mistake they are," she told him, her eyes blazing with the intelligence and determination that had first captured his attention, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to challenge him. "You're treating love like weakness instead of recognizing it as another form of strength, maybe the most important form. A king who cares deeply makes better decisions, not worse ones, because he understands what he's truly protecting and why it matters." Her words shattered the false choice he'd been torturing himself with, revealing a third path he'd been too frightened and confused to see clearly. Together, working as the team they'd become over months of shared challenges and growing trust, they began crafting a response that used his emotional growth as political strength rather than hiding it as shameful weakness. Every decision he'd made from love had actually improved his kingdom's welfare when viewed from the right perspective. His marriage had brought talented counsel into the royal circle. His openness to emotion had made him more connected to his people's genuine needs. His willingness to fight for personal honor had demonstrated the kind of courage his subjects deserved from their leader. The conspiracy's greatest weapon, his transformation from cold calculator to emotionally intelligent leader, could become his greatest shield if he had the courage to embrace it fully rather than apologizing for it. The revelation transformed everything about how he understood the crisis and his options for responding to it. Instead of defending his choices as politically justified despite their emotional origins, he could present them as evidence of evolved leadership that enhanced rather than compromised his effectiveness. The man who'd learned to love wasn't weaker than the king who'd ruled in isolation. He was infinitely stronger because he understood what truly mattered and why it was worth protecting with everything he possessed. Chapter 20. Building the Alliance. Armed with new understanding and renewed purpose, King Darian began reaching out to allies he'd neglected during his period of isolation and self-doubt, but this time his approach was fundamentally different from the political calculations that had characterized his previous 8 years of rule. Instead of appealing to their fear of consequences or their sense of feudal obligation, he spoke directly to their hopes for what their kingdom could become under leadership that valued both strategic thinking and human connection, both military strength and moral courage. He shared his vision of governance that combined traditional royal authority with emotional intelligence that recognized the importance of both protecting the realm from external threats and nurturing the bonds that held their society together from within. Many nobles who'd wavered in uncertainty, caught between old loyalties and new fears, found themselves drawn to this authentic passion for leadership that went beyond mere political survival to embrace a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve people rather than simply ruling them. The common people's response surprised everyone involved, including the conspirators who'd assumed that emotional leadership would be seen as weakness by those who needed strength from their king. Stories spread throughout the kingdom of their monarch's willingness to fight personally for love and justice, his inclusion of his queen in important decisions, his visible happiness that made him more approachable and relatable than he'd ever been during his years of cold efficiency. Merchants spoke of feeling genuinely heard in ways they never had before. Farmers praised his attention to their practical concerns. Soldiers respected his courage in personal combat more than his strategic brilliance. Most importantly, King Darian discovered that vulnerability could be a powerful form of leadership when wielded with wisdom and courage. By admitting his struggles openly, sharing his growth honestly, acknowledging his mistakes while firmly defending his choices and their positive outcomes, he created genuine connection rather than fearful distance. The king who'd once ruled through intimidation and respect based on position now governed through inspiration and trust, earned through authentic character. His enemies had fundamentally underestimated how hungry people were for real leadership, for someone who governed with both head and heart fully engaged, for a ruler who understood that strength without compassion was merely tyranny, while compassion without strength was meaningless sentiment. Chapter 21. The Counterattack. The formal hearing where his fitness to rule would be decided became an opportunity for transformation rather than merely a threat to be survived. Instead of defending his actions as politically justified despite their emotional origins, King Darian presented them as evidence of evolved leadership that his kingdom desperately needed in an era when traditional approaches were proving inadequate to address complex challenges. He spoke eloquently about the crucial difference between ruling through fear and ruling through inspiration, between making decisions in isolation and making them with trusted counsel from diverse perspectives. When his enemies methodically presented their carefully collected evidence of emotional decision-making, treating each instance as proof of dangerous weakness that compromised royal judgment, King Darian systematically reframed every supposed failure as evidence of growth and strength. His rescue of Lyra demonstrated commitment to justice over mere convenience. His inclusion of her in governance showed wisdom in seeking diverse perspectives, rather than clinging to outdated traditions. His acceptance of Kieran's challenge proved willingness to face consequences personally, rather than hiding behind others' sacrifice when honor demanded personal action. Every supposed weakness became a strength when viewed from the proper angle. Every emotional choice revealed its practical benefits when examined honestly, rather than through the lens of prejudice against change. The hearing became a masterclass in reframing narrative, in transforming apparent liabilities into demonstrated assets, in proving that evolution and growth were signs of strength rather than weakness in any leader worth following into an uncertain future. The turning point came when he called Lyra to testify on her own behalf, allowing her to speak directly to the assembled nobles about their partnership and its benefits to the kingdom. Her passionate defense of their collaborative approach, her detailed knowledge of governance issues that impressed even skeptical lords, her articulate vision for their realm's future under leadership that valued both traditional wisdom and innovative thinking, proved conclusively that his emotional choices had brought practical benefits that strengthened rather than weakened his rule. She wasn't just his wife, but his most valuable advisor, and their love story had become a model for the kind of collaborative leadership their people needed in an increasingly complex world. Under the weight of her testimony and the logic of their shared vision, the conspiracy began crumbling like a wall built on sand rather than solid foundation. Chapter 22. The Climax. Judgment Day. The final vote on his fitness to rule became far more than a referendum on one king's personal choices. It evolved into a fundamental decision about the future of leadership itself and what kind of ruler their kingdom needed to face the challenges ahead. In his closing statement, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who'd finally learned to integrate all aspects of his character into effective leadership, King Darian didn't just defend his specific choices, but challenged his accusers to consider what kind of realm they wanted. One ruled by fear or by inspiration, one governed by cold calculation alone, or by wisdom that included emotional intelligence as a crucial component. "I have been two kinds of king," he declared, his voice carrying across the assembly hall with quiet conviction that commanded attention from even his harshest critics. "One who ruled through the strength of walls, protecting myself from feeling, from connection, from the vulnerability that comes with genuinely caring about anything beyond political necessity. And one who rules through the strength of bridges, connecting with my people, my advisors, my queen, understanding that true strength comes not from what we can bear alone in isolation, but from what we can build together through trust and shared purpose." He spoke of the lonely years when his competence had been unquestionable, but his leadership had lacked the human touch that transformed mere governance into genuine service. He acknowledged the risks inherent in emotional leadership, while demonstrating through specific examples how those risks had been balanced by benefits that cold calculation alone could never have achieved. He painted a vision of kingship that honored traditional strengths while embracing new understanding about what it meant to serve people who deserved leaders capable of both strength and compassion. The vote, when it finally came after hours of debate and deliberation, wasn't even close to the narrow margin his enemies had expected. Not only did his traditional allies support him overwhelmingly, but several former opponents crossed over, convinced by his demonstration that emotional growth enhanced rather than compromised leadership ability when properly integrated with wisdom and experience. The conspiracy collapsed not through political maneuvering or intimidation, but through the simple power of authentic leadership that touched people's hopes rather than exploiting their fears. The boy king who'd ruled through distance and calculation was finally, officially dead, replaced by a man king whose fitness had been affirmed by his people's deliberate choice rather than mere inherited obligation. Chapter 23. Falling Action. The New Order. In the aftermath of his political victory, which felt more like vindication than mere survival, King Darian found himself leading a fundamentally transformed court where relationships had been clarified and improved rather than simply preserved. The conspiracy's exposure had cleared away old power structures based on fear and rigid tradition, replacing them with new arrangements built on trust, shared vision, and mutual respect. Former enemies either converted to genuine alliance based on admiration for his evolved leadership or quietly removed themselves from positions where they could cause future harm to the realm's stability. The kingdom itself felt lighter, more hopeful, energized by leadership that inspired rather than merely intimidated. King Darian's willingness to be vulnerable while remaining strong, to admit growth while maintaining authority, to share power while accepting ultimate responsibility, had created a new model of governance that people could believe in rather than simply endure. The changes rippled through every level of society, as others began emulating the collaborative approach that had proven so effective at the highest levels of leadership. More importantly for his personal journey, the transformation was now complete and irreversible. The man who'd once isolated himself behind royal protocol and emotional barriers now moved freely among his people, confident in his ability to balance openness with necessary authority. His relationship with Lyra had become the cornerstone of his leadership style, collaborative without being weak, honest without being naive, built on mutual respect and shared responsibility that enhanced rather than compromised his effectiveness as king. The changes manifested in concrete improvements throughout his realm. Council meetings became genuinely collaborative rather than merely ceremonial, with diverse voices contributing to decisions that affected everyone. The people felt heard and valued in ways they never had before, their king's emotional availability making him accessible without compromising his dignity or authority. Enemy kingdoms, expecting to find weakness they could exploit, instead found themselves dealing with a leader whose authenticity made him more formidable rather than less because his people truly believed in him and would fight harder for someone they loved than they ever had for someone they merely feared. Chapter 24. Resolution: The Man and the Crown. 1 year after the crisis that had nearly cost him his throne and everything he'd learned to value, King Darian stood once again on his battlements in the pre-dawn darkness that had once been his only refuge from the pressures of leadership. But this time the ritual had been transformed. He wasn't alone with his burdens and fears, seeking solitary peace in isolation. Lyra stood beside him, their hands intertwined as they watched their kingdom wake to another day of peace and prosperity, their presence together a symbol of everything he'd learned about strength found through connection rather than separation. The castle below buzzed with life and purpose, no longer the cold fortress of his isolated years, but a true home filled with people who served not merely from duty, but from genuine devotion to a leader they respected and admired. The transformation extended far beyond his personal relationships to encompass his entire approach to governance, creating an environment where loyalty was earned rather than demanded, where service was inspired rather than compelled, where excellence emerged from shared commitment rather than fear of punishment. The weight of the crown felt fundamentally different now, not lighter, because the responsibilities remained as serious as ever, but distributed across stronger shoulders that could bear the load more effectively. Every burden was shared appropriately, every decision informed by love as well as logic, every challenge faced with the knowledge that he didn't stand alone against the forces that threatened his people's welfare. The kingdom prospered under leadership that combined the strength to make hard choices with the wisdom to make compassionate ones, proving that the integration of heart and mind produced better results than either could achieve alone. As the sun rose over his lands, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded him of hope made visible, King Darian reflected on the incredible journey from the lonely, calculating man he'd been to the complete leader he'd finally become. The boy who'd inherited a crown too young and wore it like armor against the world had finally grown into someone truly worthy of the responsibility it represented. Not despite learning to love, but precisely because of that learning. In choosing Lyra, he'd chosen to become his best and most authentic self. In opening his heart to another person, he'd discovered his true strength as both man and king. The eternal tension between personal fulfillment and public duty had been resolved not through sacrifice but through integration, proving that the greatest leaders were those who brought their complete selves to the service of others. Chapter 25. Epilogue: Legacy. Years later, when historians would write of Alpha King Darian's reign with the perspective that only time could provide, they would mark his transformation as the turning point that defined a new era of leadership, not just in his kingdom but throughout the known world. The king who had learned to love without losing his strength became a model for future rulers across many realms, proving through practical demonstration that the greatest power came not from emotional distance but from emotional intelligence properly integrated with traditional wisdom and strategic thinking. His partnership with Queen Lyra redefined royal marriage from mere political alliance to genuine collaboration that enhanced both partners and strengthened their realm immeasurably. Their children grew up witnessing leadership as service rather than dominance, love as strength rather than weakness, vulnerability as courage rather than failure. The kingdom they would inherit was built not on fear but on trust, not on isolation but on connection, not on the brittle strength of walls, but on the flexible strength of bridges that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential integrity. And in quiet moments, when the endless demands of crown and kingdom allowed them brief respites from public service, Alpha King Darian and Lyra would remember the night it all began, a wedding disrupted by truth, a rescue that became mutual salvation, a choice to love that became the foundation for everything they built together. The knight's betrayal, which had seemed so devastating at the time, had actually set them free to discover what real love could accomplish when it was strong enough to bear the weight of a crown and wise enough to transform that weight from burden into purpose. Their love story had become their kingdom's story, proving that the most personal revolutions often have the most far-reaching and lasting consequences for the world around them.